Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Current. This is the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. Looking forward to spending some time with you today. I'm Rebecca Power, joining you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I will be your moderator. Since some of you may be new to the North Central Region Water Network, we are an extension-led collaboration among 12 universities and our partners in 12 upper Midwestern states. Before we get into our topic for today, from all of us here at the North Central Region Water Network, and thanks Janice for that musical interlude before we got started here, we wish all of you, your families, your loved ones, a safe and restful holiday season. We are grateful for all that you do and all that you're doing and will do in 2021 to care for our land and water and each other. That said, we are going to jump right into our topic, nutrient management practices and their co-benefits. So as all of you know, nutrient management practices are critical not only for supporting our farms and agriculture, but for reducing the loss of those nutrients and reducing the negative impacts downstream of the loss of those nutrients. And there are other benefits that those nutrient management practices can provide. So we are going to hear a little bit today about some of the co-benefits of nutrient management practices, including water supply management, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration, and the farm bottom line. We'll also hear from one of our presenters, our last presenters, about a tool to help measure some of those impacts. Before we introduce our speakers, just a few notes to all of you that are joining us as participants, and you can see them here on your screen. Please submit any questions that you have for our presenters in the chat box. The chat box is accessible with the little purple tab in the lower right hand portion of your screen, and clicking on that little chat bubble. We will save all of your questions for after each of our three presenters is finished, and we try to leave a good amount of time for questions at the end. A phone-in option is also available for this session if you're having any audio difficulty. So you can access the phone-in option using the session menu. In the upper left-hand corner of your screen, there's a little hamburger menu there, and you can go in there and select use your phone for audio. We do record these sessions. They are available either at northcentralwater.org or learn.extension.org. We do live tweet these sessions, so please feel free to join along with us. And also, we would love to have you join our listserv and stay tuned with more news from the North Central Region Water Network. Okay, now on to our presenters. We are so pleased to have Chris Hay, Senior Research Scientist at Iowa Soybean Association, Laura Payne, who is the Outreach Coordinator for Grassland 2.0, a USDA NIFA-funded project based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and John Tyndall, who is an Associate Professor at Iowa State University. And here's a little more info on where you can follow for the live tweets. Okay, with no further ado, Dr. Chris Hay. So a little bit about him here. As I said, a senior research scientist at the Iowa Soybean Association, been at land-grant universities, now at Iowa Soybean, and in his many roles has more than 25 years experience in agricultural water management. So let's give the time over to him so he can share a little bit more about what he's been up to. And
all right.
There we go.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Going to talk a little bit about the idea of recycling drainage water, ag drainage water, in particular subsurface or tile drainage water, in a practice that we appropriately enough call drainage water recycling, and then some of the different benefits that we can realize from doing that. So starting off with a little background and rationale on why we might want to consider that. I think we all know that crops need water to grow, but any of us that have tried to grow plants, depending on rainfall, also know that too often we don't get that water at the time that we want it or in the amounts that we need it to do that as well as we might like. And so both too little and too much water can be a challenge when we're trying to grow crops. And if we look at crop loss, and this is data from RMA on crop insurance claims, and we can see that almost 3/4 of those crop insurance claims relate to either one of those conditions of too much or too little water. So in the Midwest, where I'm at, then historically we've primarily been most concerned about too much water in the spring especially. And so to address that, we've built extensive networks of subsurface drains or tiles to remove that excess water from the root zone, carry it out to ditches and convey that water downstream to get it out of the fields. So that's been a huge boon for crop production in the Midwest, and there's many areas of the Midwest where we couldn't grow crops very well without those subsurface drains, and that drainage continues today and increases in intensity and application. But along with that drainage, we also then convey nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphorus that leach below the root zone and are carried with that drainage water and then released out to surface water. So that creates a number of impacts on water quality locally, but then also is leading contributor to some of our bigger regional water quality issues. And so the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone or the algal blooms in Lake Erie or Chesapeake Bay issues, all of those are related to nutrient loss and in particular nutrient loss from drainage systems. When we think about too little water, at least in the Midwest, historically irrigation hasn't been quite as widely adopted. Certainly there's areas of coarser textured soils or soils with low water holding capacity where irrigation is important, but historically we haven't seen widespread adoption of irrigation in the Midwest, but certainly in more recent years we are seeing an increase in irrigation in the Midwest to address that there are times in the summer when we don't have as much water as we'd like to have to boost our crop yields up towards that yield potential. But as we look forward and thinking about future climate and what the climate projections show is that unfortunately both of these conditions look like they're going to get worse. And so the projections show that we're likely to see more rain in the spring, leading to more nutrient loss, and then more frequent and longer droughts in the summer that will depress crop yields. And so this idea of drainage water recycling then is a way to try and address both of those concerns and hopefully create then more resilient cropping systems. And so if we can capture that drainage water in the spring when we've got too much water, hold that in a reservoir, and we can then recycle that back into the field in summer as supplemental irrigation water to boost or support crop yield. And so a number of different ways that we can configure a drainage water recycling system, different reservoir configurations, different irrigation systems, different pumping systems. And so this figure from the Transforming Drainage Project helps illustrate some of the different choices that we can make as far as designing a system. And then here's a couple quick examples of some systems in Iowa. So this one, the field there on the left, that water drains to the reservoir outlined there on the right, and then that water's pumped back and into the field through those same drainage pipes as sub-irrigation back into the field as supplemental irrigation. Another field, actually from the same farm family, but a different configuration here. The field drains into that reservoir in the bottom right there, and then is used to supply a center pivot that irrigates the area highlighted there in green. So again, there are a number of different ways that we can configure a system to do this depending on our specific conditions. But again, with kind of that rationale and background, some of the excitement around this idea of drainage water recycling is we've got the potential for a number of different win-win combinations by implementing this practice. And so certainly there's the water quality benefits that if we recycle that water, we're also recycling the nutrients that would otherwise be lost with that water. And so from that aspect, it's important for those of us that are working on and trying to find ways to improve water quality from agricultural systems. But unlike many of our other, especially drainage edge of field practices, this one also has the potential to boost crop yield and have an impact back to the farmer. And so, things like bioreactors or saturated buffers or wetlands or some of these other edge of field practices that really don't have a yield benefit to the farmer, this is one that actually does help provide some support to that bottom line to the farmer, and so hopefully better incentivizes the practice. When we think about the water quality aspects, a lot of our conservation practices either target nitrogen or phosphorus, or at least target one more than the other. But by recycling that water, we're actually having a positive impact on both of those nutrients. And so that's a benefit as well. And then for the farmer, that system then again helps manage both for too much water on the left there and then too little water again in the summer when those crops are really demanding more water. And then if we think more of a landscape scale, if we do this at a large enough scale, by putting more storage out on the landscape, we can also then potentially have some impact on downstream water quantity or downstream flooding, particularly smaller and moderate flooding events, as well as water quality. So to get an idea of some of the potential water quality benefits we might see, this is a little modeling work that we did looking at two sites, one in Iowa and Indiana, and this is for the Indiana site. And so if we're looking at captured water on the left and then nitrate and soluble reactive phosphorus load reductions as a function of reservoir size on the y-axis. And so as you might expect, as we increase reservoir size, we capture more water, and as we capture more water, we also capture more nutrient that we prevent from going downstream. So what we found with this study was a reservoir of about 6% to 8% of the area that we're irrigating using the assumed 10-foot depth that we used for the study was enough to meet the crop water demands for irrigation. And then we saw about a 20 to 30% nutrient load reduction on average, but then certainly quite a bit more than that in some years. Looking at crop yield benefits, this is a summary of some of the information that we've got on fields that have been monitored using this practice. Certainly we need some more research on what the crop yield benefits are, but from this limited data set, we do see that there is some potential for some good crop yield benefits, particularly in some years from implementing this practice. So, and again, we got the potential to address both water quality, but also crop production. But then there's also other, some of these co-benefits or other benefits that can go along with implementing this practice. And so one that we've already mentioned up there in the upper left, if we build enough of these, they're going to act similar to what a retention or detention ponds that we build in the urban landscape to deal with flooding issues. And so having more storage on the landscape gives us more storage for flood peak reduction and hopefully then impacting downstream flooding concerns. Another one there on the bottom left, potential for wildlife benefits. And so some of these systems have seen incidental wildlife benefits just from having that storage there for amphibians and other species. But certainly as we think about ways to design these, there's potential we could design in even more wildlife benefits if that's a priority. In the middle there, by having a little more reliable water supply, We've also got the potential to support more diversified cropping systems and potentially higher valued cropping systems. And so, again, could be another benefit to the farmers and the food production system. And I guess thinking a little further out as to potential benefits, on the right there is this idea of photovoltaics. And so using that reservoir surface area to support floating solar panels to help support energy production. So again, relatively new that this practice has been monitored. It's not a new idea, but at least new in implementation and in thinking about it. So there's a number of research questions that we still need to answer to really support really adopting this practice at a larger scale. And probably primary among those is the economics. So what are the costs and benefits of the system? Right now, it seems likely that, at least in the near term, that the agronomic benefits on their own are probably not enough to support the adoption of the practice, particularly if we've got to take land out of production for storage. But as we look at the multiple benefits, if we can quantify and value those, then that might help support other ways to help incentivize these practices. So refer you to the transformingdrainage.org, that Transforming Drainage project, for more information. And this extension publication in particular is a good summary of the practice. And then to wrap up my time then, a quick summary that drainage water recycling can provide multiple benefits, certainly for crop production and water quality, but then there's potential for multiple other complementary benefits. There's more research needed, but the research we've got so far shows that there is potential for the practice in the Midwest to boost crop yields and improve water quality, but we do need more research to quantify the benefits to support financing, whether it's through traditional cost share or market-based approaches or other alternative financing to help incentivize the adoption of the practice. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rebecca to move on to our next speaker.
There we go. Okay, I guess you couldn't hear me, so I wasn't seeing my microphone, so sorry about that. Thank you, Chris, so much, and good to see a couple of questions there in the chat box, including one from our next presenter, Laura Payne. So Laura is going to tell us a little bit, so Laura is the Outreach Coordinator for Grassland 2.0, as I said, based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has a long and storied history of being involved in regenerative agriculture education and research in the upper Midwest, and has held a diversity of roles in doing so. So she's got expertise in a lot of sectors. So thank you so much, Laura, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and engage with this very robust network of extension folks across the region. I wanted to talk today a little bit. We're going to switch gears quite a bit and talk about working grasslands in the north central region and the potential for carbon sequestration. And I'm aware that across this region, the definition of working grasslands is going to vary a lot from out in the western states where we've got native rangeland that's being grazed, and back here to the kind of the humid east region. And I'll apologize in advance for my Wisconsin-centric photos of dairy cows. So I did want to talk a little bit about our the overall project that I'm involved in, and kind of the theme and the goals. We're really looking at fostering and promoting the reintegration of livestock into a lot of areas across the region that have become very heavily annually cropped, and thinking that by strategic placement of perennials on those landscapes, we can actually gain some significant benefits in terms of water quality and other ecosystem services, as well as in economics and profitability. So this would be a big, massive challenge to make a transformation like that, and we realize that. And to talk about or to work on developing a plan for this transformation. We have a fairly extensive team looking at things both from a top-down perspective, looking at kind of big picture supply chains and policy drivers of our ag systems, as well as really wanting to engage in local conversations with communities and think about, what it takes to make a change on a farm by farm basis, and what farmers and local communities think about what their future should look like and how to get there. You'll see a couple of familiar names and faces in this diagram of our partners and our team. Ann Nardi is our communications director for the project, and Rebecca Power, who you all know, is the lead for these local learning hubs where we're trying to foster these conversations. So jumping into the topic a little bit more closely, one of the key benefits of perennial cover and well-managed pastures in our farming systems is some of the environmental or ecosystem services that they provide. This is some data from the UW Discovery Farms project, which shows this left-hand maroon bar is sediment losses from an acre of annual row crop system. The purple bar is dairy cropping systems that would incorporate alfalfa into the rotation, and then these almost invisible bars across the bottom are past systems. So we can really minimize erosion, soil erosion, and improve water quality performance of these farm fields with perennial cover. There's also benefits in terms of wildlife and pollinator habitat, and as this presentation is going to look more closely at carbon sequestration. So before I do that, though, I just want to share some data on the economics of managed grazing systems. And when we think about as our livestock production systems are becoming more consolidated and more confinement-based, pasture and managed grazing is the lowest cost forage production system that we can implement. And this graph comes from about 20 years of data showing that we can push up milk production in this case higher and higher, but that comes at increasing costs in terms of the cost per cow, which is this dark blue bar. And this comparison between a confinement system and a grazing system shows that while you're producing less income and less milk per cow, the cost of that production is so much less that the net profit is actually greater. And you can basically, in this graph, one grazing cow actually generates about 4 times as much income as a confinement dairy cow. So that's one of the arguments we can make as we move forward in engaging livestock farmers and other farmers in terms of reintegrating livestock into the landscape. So when we think about carbon sequestration, I wanted to share that the most productive soils on the planet, which are these in red here, were formed under grasslands, and grasses in particular are very effective at sequestering carbon in the soil because of their fibrous root systems and because most of their production is actually goes on underground, or a significant part of it does. And all of these grasslands where this carbon has been stored for centuries and millennia were grazed. So if we can figure out how to graze them effectively and economically, it's kind of a win-win situation. So talking about what are the variables that contribute to carbon sequestration or carbon storage in the soil, there are a lot of variables. And we've tried to summarize those in this sheet that we have a link here for it. It's on the Greenlands Blue Waters website as well as on the Grassland 2.0 website. I do want to Make the disclaimer that I'm not a soil scientist. I guess I would call myself a pasture ecologist. So I know enough about the agronomy and the animal science and the soils to make the system work. So my colleague Randy Jackson from the University of Wisconsin contributed significantly to putting this fact sheet together. So the major drivers of soil carbon sequestration are soil type and texture and climate. So those are things that we don't really have a lot of control over, but they do influence how much carbon we can store. These other factors we'll go through are things that we can control and that we can manage in ways to maximize carbon sequestration. Knowing that this is a relatively young science and there are a lot of unknowns and a lot of research being done as we speak. So one of the things we do know is that promoting soil health, whether you're raising pasture or annual crops, soil health is a key to carbon accumulation in the soil. If we keep those soil bugs and the soil microbiome healthy, we're going to increase their capacity to store carbon. Soil health principles, as you can see listed here, the great thing about pasture is it kind of ticks all those boxes, and it provides a really ideal microclimate in the soil for those soil bugs to do their work. Many researchers have found that we can gain significantly in soil carbon by transitioning annual cropping to perennial working grasslands. This meta-analysis that I cite here showed about a 39 or 40% increase on average across 42 studies around the world when you transition from annual crops to perennial crops. And as you can see, there's a lag phase here. This is a study that was done in the southeast U.S. As the soil repairs itself, depending on the prior cropping system, you get a fairly rapid accumulation of carbon in the soil, and then there's this plateau, which is kind of driven by, as I said, climate and soil type. And I guess the goal a lot of us are looking at is how can we get past that plateau and continue increasing the carbon in the soil. One of the things we need to kind of think about is we think about carbon accumulation in soil is that researchers are think in terms of two types of soil carbon. Particulate organic matter is actually decomposing plant materials, which is a less stable form of soil carbon. And we know that it can kind of continue accumulating. This graph shows in the red is forest soils and the blue is grassland soils. The more stable form of soil carbon that can really, that is what forms the core of soil carbon is the mineral associated organic matter, which is microbial processed. So it's like microbe bodies and substances that the microbes produce as they decompose the particulate organic matter. And you can see that that does saturate and kind of levels off with time. So knowing this, we can manage our grazing to improve and increase carbon storage. We can do that through grazing management, increasing species diversity, focusing on increasing rooting depth, and then warm season versus cool season pastures. Warm seasons have a much deeper rooting depth in general, so that's going to promote carbon storage. One of the reasons for this is that most of our crops, and this includes both cool season pastures and annual crops, have most of their root system in the upper foot or so of the soil. So the carbon kind of tends to saturate in that layer, and then it's tough to add more carbon into that soil unless you add it deeper down in the soil profile. So to improve soil carbon sequestration in pasture systems, one of the primary things we can do is improve our management. So in moving away from a continuously grazed situation toward smaller and smaller paddocks. More often you move the cattle, and this 30 days, 30 paddocks would be a dairy rotation, or maybe even every 12 hours would be more appropriate. This is going to improve nutrient distribution of soil or of manure and urine nutrients, improves nutrient cycling, and also increase rooting depth. And then there's a lot of research that shows that increasing species diversity in pastures leads to not only more carbon storage deeper in the soil profile, but also greater productivity. This is a study that looked at a 2-species mix in the green and a 11-species mix in the blue. And across this top chart, we're seeing increasing depth in the soil, and you can just see that there's an increasing amount of root penetration deeper into the soil system, and a significantly higher volume of roots within that soil profile. And that actually leads to greater yields, either with haying management or grazing management. So that's one argument for doing this, for increasing productivity or increasing species diversity. This study is another one from the same researchers, looking at a 2 and 5 species mix and documenting soil organic carbon accumulation over 9 years. And so to read this top bar in each of the graphs is the total soil profile, the total amount of soil organic carbon that was sequestered over the 9 years of this study, significantly greater than the 2 species mix. And you can see there's where that increase is down in these deeper depths in the soil profile. And then finally, I'll just wrap up by saying that this was just kind of a quick overview. There's a lot we don't know about how to manage pastures to maximize soil organic carbon. So kind of stay tuned. More and more research is being done. This fact sheet that I mentioned earlier does summarize the current research and has a nice list of references at the end. So I encourage you to visit that website and take a look at that. With that, I'll turn it back over to Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Laura, so much. And I will we'll get on to our next speaker. So staying in the vein of increased perennial cover on the landscape, we're gonna hear from John Tyndall next. So John is a natural resource economist and associate professor at Iowa State, and he has a broad interest in environmental and natural resource economics, policy, and sociology. And he is going to talk to us a little bit about a new tool for looking at the benefits of the economic benefits of prairie and tree planting as part of an overall strategy on farm, and of course managing nutrients through that increased perennial cover. So go ahead, John. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that introduction. I hope you all can hear me well enough. So I'm going to talk to you today about it's an online field scale decision support tool called the Prairie and Tree Planting Tool, or PT squared for short. And it's a tool designed for landowners, farmers, to sort of explore opportunities to strategically integrate perennial conservation practices. The tool focuses on tree and or prairie-based practices, and for today's conversation I'm going to focus mostly on the prairie side of things. And the impetus for creating this decision support tool comes from work done with the Prairie Strips Research Project at Iowa State University, where a multidisciplinary team of researchers have now for over 10 years been investigating the biophysical as well as the economic outcomes associated with strategically integrating relatively small amounts of prairie in fields or around fields in ways that create ecosystem outcomes relative to water quality as well as biodiversity. So thinking in terms of strategic integration, and they're put in places where they're going to intercept or otherwise receive field runoff for water quality benefits, enhancing infiltration and creating zones of enhanced water storage, soil water storage capacity, and those kinds of things. And then from a biodiversity standpoint, it creates habitat, but it also can be done in a way to create enhanced connectivity and continuity with perennial patches within the landscape and so on. And our research has pretty conclusively shown that there are very significant important outcomes to the landowner as well as to society broadly speaking associated with just a relatively small amount of prairie integration. Okay, so relative to biodiversity, we've quantified an increase in native plant species for sure, but we've also quantified an increase in pollinator species, pollinator abundance, the same with grassland bird species and abundance and so on. And then relative to water quality indicators, we've quantified fairly significant reductions in runoff, concomitant reductions in soil export, significant reductions in phosphorus export, nitrogen export, and so on. In order for landowners and their advisors to sort of identify these areas where these types of outcomes can occur, well, they need access to lots of different kinds of data. Soil data, topography data, land use data, and all of those kinds of things. So we created this tool. And so this is the PT squared interface, and it kind of looks like Google Earth, or Google Maps, or even arcgis.com if you're familiar with that tool. And it allows users to look at different data layers or to combine them. And I'm going to talk about these in turn. Users can navigate to different places in Iowa to explore. They can use the tree planting or prairie planting applications. They can measure distance and area and those sorts of things. And then they can access fairly comprehensive financial reports associated with the designs that they've created. And I'll talk about all of these in turn. Users can save or upload designs that they've made. They can download shape files and other geospatial data to use with other GIS related tools or to give to contractors if they're actually going to plant the things, and so on. Here's a web link to our website as well as the application itself. It's a beta version at the moment. And right now the data, the financial data, is calibrated for Iowa. We are actively looking for partners and collaborators to expand the data set to other states. So let's sort of look at what some of this data is all about. Here's a sort of an example farm in northwest Iowa. And I've layered together here some spring flown ortho photos, high resolution aerial photos. I've also showing 2-foot contour topography maps. That's what these yellow lines are showing there. I've also have the LiDAR hillshade data, the LiDAR being that very high resolution microtopographic variation data that's available for the entire state. And using this combination of information, landowners can explore topography. They can look at landscape positions. They can look at aspect. They can identify areas where runoff is likely to occur, where soil is going to be vulnerable for erosion and then sediment movement and all of these kinds of things. And then if users are interested in looking at the soils, they just need to click the soil layer, and they have a soil map where they can click anywhere on the map. They can explore the different soils that are there. This will provide the soil unit name, basic characteristics, but then it also provides the corn suitability rating, which is used in the state of Iowa. It's a productivity index that is used to set soil rent markets. And so we use soil rent as the proxy for the opportunity cost of land. So if you're looking at taking some land out of production to use for conservation, we used land rent as that opportunity cost. So we've created some data layers that landowners can look at to identify areas within their farm fields that might carry some of these lower opportunity costs and so on. So once you've kind of explored the fields and are looking for some opportunities, then you can apply the planting application. And here's where it is: we plant Prairie, and it leads the user to a polygon drawing tool. And you can basically zoom in and draw in, as you wish, a prairie system. And in this particular example, I've got some prairie located on some contours here, as well as some prairie on some foot slopes. These prairie strips would be designed to intercept runoff that's occurring in these farm fields, as well as holding on to some soil in some really vulnerable areas relative to topography. They also happen to be located in really low opportunity cost areas. So once you've created your design, the tool then allows the user to really create a system that's specific to the site, but also specific to their interests. So it'll provide some basic information about the design at hand, but it'll also provide drop-down menus for seed mixes, for example. And the only seed mixes that are shown are the ones that are suitable for the soil moisture conditions that are present within the design. So we have all the soils in Iowa categorized on ranging from hydric soils, really wet soils, to xeric soils, really dry soils, and everything in between. And then we have current retail prices associated with these pre-made mixes. So again, landowners can choose whatever type of system that they're looking at. They can enter that in, and then they can choose some basic management options. In this particular example, they could choose between mowing and baling the Prairie system, or they could burn on a 3-year cycle. This is, here's a picture of what burning looks like in the field. So you select burn in this particular example, and then you go to the report. This is where the comprehensive financial data is provided. And so the financial assessment is based on comprehensive enterprise budgets that are calibrated by the users in terms of the seed mix that they want to look at, in terms of the management choices they've made. And then it uses discounted cash flow analysis over a 15-year planning horizon, and it takes all of that cost information and it annualizes it so that users can compare the costs of a perennial system, which tend to be more periodic. They can compare those with the costs of their annual cropping system, which they're used to, so that they've got more of an apples to apples kind of a view. And then the data is also broken down into different cost categories. So site preparation, establishment, here's that data being shown there, management costs, opportunity costs of land. And then landowners can also explore the opportunities associated with existing conservation programs. So in this case, they could choose to be part of the Conservation Reserve Program. They can look at CP42, which is the pollinator habitat program, or they could look at CP43, which is the relatively new prairie strip program, and then that factors in those payments. So again, landowners can explore opportunities with and without conservation program money, and so on. And so once they've sort of designed their system and calculated the costs and have a pretty good feel for what they would be in for, ultimately the Prairie, the PT squared tool is really meant to be used as part of a suite of other decision support tools or analysis, so that not only do interested landowners know what their investment needs are, they can also other ways to think about the benefits of integrating Prairie into their system. So very quickly, I did a subfield profitability analysis here. And in this particular example, by removing 7 low-yielding, chronically unprofitable acres, or about 13% of the row crop acreage, the landowner would get an estimated net income boost of about $405. And then I did another analysis using crop prices and costs going back to 2013. And that showed that with the Prairie system as designed here, the landowner would have experienced an average total absolute benefit of about $1,500 per year, or about $220 per acre per year. So consider that under a CRP contract, the Prairie as designed would cost about $66 per acre per year. The subfield benefits alone more than compensate for the cost of the conservation effort. And then, very quickly, I'm running out of time. I also use the USDA nutrient tracking tool, which is a hydrologic simulation model, to sort of verify, and this is what a landowner could do to verify that their efforts are in fact creating benefits for society relative to water quality purposes. And so, with that system as shown, 64% reduction in total N, 45% reduction in total phosphorus, 43% reduction in sediment, and so on. So it is verifying that society is also benefiting from this particular system. And then lastly, I'll just sort of leave you with this. This is a quote from one of our cooperators. This is Seth Watkins. He runs a grass-fed cow-calf operation. He also has row crops. But he leases conservation ground for hunting, and he receives carbon credits from the system. But it's this kind of sentiment that we can't measure this, right? But it's critically important relative to co-benefits and so on. And so I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, John. And we know that this is just a tease, sort of an introduction to some of these things that Chris and Laura and John are working on. But we hope that introducing you to them, if you don't know them already, you can follow up with them and get more specifics from them. But for now, we still have them with us, and we'll get to questions. So if you have additional questions for our speakers, please go ahead and put them in the chat box now, and I will go to the questions that we have. So Tess asks Chris if you can talk about any regulatory hurdles that may be present to building and utilizing drainage water recycling systems.
Sure. Yeah. Regulatory issues are something that'll have to be worked through, and there's multiple potential hurdles that have been realized, and then are also potential hurdles. And so, certainly, in some cases, if we can take advantage of topography and actually build an impoundment in a waterway, there's some benefit to doing that, but then that triggers potentially 404 permit issues. If you're building storage in wet areas, then again, you've got potential wetland regulations, and so either or both of those may require some mitigation. Depending on the state that you're working in, there may be some irrigation regulations that you'll have to work with, and so you may require an irrigation permit, and especially if you're supplementing the drainage water, which some folks do, either with pumping some groundwater or surface water to help fill the reservoir beyond what you can get with just the captured drainage water, that's likely going to trigger an irrigation permit. Depending on the size of the storage and height of the dam or impoundment, there may be some dam safety regulations and permits that would be required because of that. And then if you're part of a multi-user drainage system or drainage district, there may be some regulatory hurdles going through that process to get something like this approved. So yeah. All depends on the specific situation and location, but there's certainly regulatory hurdles that are out there.
Chris, just a quick follow-up from me, Rebecca, has the Transforming Drainage Project, did you all do anything related to some of those regulatory hurdles, or are there resources on the Transforming Drainage site that we can look at?
That's something we haven't really gotten into, so don't really have anything on it on transforming drainage. There's a little bit of information on one of the sites up in Minnesota on the process that they had to go through to get theirs permitted, but we took advantage of some existing sites and only constructed a few new ones, and most of those were on research farms, and so that avoided some of the permitting issues that otherwise would have been there. But there was one site in particular that was built by a landowner that did have to jump through a number of hurdles to get it in place.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And a question from Laura. And I think this is for Chris, are there any issues associated with nutrient-laden water being used by wildlife, or any other, wildlife management issues that you looked at? I'm sure like changes in water level could also be a concern at the wrong time of year. So her question, has water quality testing been done on the reservoirs?
Sure. So really only one study that I'm aware of that looks specifically at wildlife and surveying wildlife impacts, and that was some existing work out of Ohio and some systems that they built there. And those were a little unique in that they built wetlands into the system. So the drainage water went through a wetland first before going into the reservoir that they irrigated out of. And so, there was some nutrient processing from that wetland, and that wetland also helped contribute to some of those wildlife benefits. But there were some incidental benefits even from just the reservoir itself for some amphibians that they found. So, I think that's certainly still an open question, is whether there's some nutrient impacts. Certainly species that are going to be sensitive, particular to higher levels of nitrate, that could be a concern. I think if wildlife is a goal, there's hopefully some ways that we can design to try and create some of those wildlife benefits and reduce any potential negative consequences. But otherwise, it's not going to be much different than other types of storage of ag runoff as far as wildlife.
Great, thank you, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
And Suzanne asks, a question for John, have you compared the prairie strips practice with riparian buffers as required in Minnesota? She noticed the ditch running through the farm in the example. Is this an issue if not buffered?
That's a good question. So in Minnesota, the buffer law allows for landowners to utilize other practices if they so choose. So they could go with cover crops or with prairie strips or something along those lines in more upland positions. They don't have to buffer specifically. In the case of the PT squared tool, landowners could explore opportunities to buffer the stream. They could explore opportunities to create buffers or filter strips or prairie strips elsewhere and compare the costs, compare the size, and then in these ancillary analyses, they could look at, again, subfield profitability outcomes and those kinds of things. So we have, it's used for people to be able to kind of toy around with options, basically.
Great, thank you, John. And Mike next, and I think this is for Laura, in the concentrated paddock scenario with a high cattle density, wouldn't animal stress need to be considered?
And the answer is yes. Animal stress always needs to be considered. So I think one of the pictures showed a very high concentration of animals, 200,000 pounds per acre or something like that. And those moves are usually 2 to 4 hours in a paddock. So they don't do that for a long period of time. It might be just for a day or so. Normally the concentration of animals is probably between maybe 20 and 50 head per acre, which may sound like a lot, but it gives enough space for the animals to carry out their natural behaviors, and it's a fairly low stress setting. But within all of these livestock systems, reducing animal stress is a really important consideration for productivity.
Okay, great, thank you, Laura. And April has a question, again, related to prairie strips. Have you looked at the differences between grass waterways and compared them to prairie strips when it comes to erosion within the property?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it kind of comes down to looking at alternative best management practices suitable for certain situations, right? So grass waterways deal with concentrated flow or gully erosion situations, whereas prairie strips deal with a different type of flow and deals with whole field erosion in various ways. Though oftentimes you look at using sort of complementary best management practices. So in many of our prairie strip sites, we've also got grass waterways to prevent that gully erosion that's happening in between the strips. But there's other tools that can look at the benefits of one practice versus another. The PT squared tool doesn't do that directly, but like the nutrient tracking tool, which I quickly demoed, does. So there are ways of investigating that more explicitly.
Thank you, John, again. And one more for you. If the prairie strips is capturing the high level of nutrients, does that mean the strip itself becomes very nutrient rich, and there must and perhaps must be cultivated in the future? Otherwise, some of these captured will be must not be cultivated in the future. Otherwise, some of these captured nutrients will be released into nearby waterways.
Yeah, that's a good question. In the case of prairie strips accumulating nutrients, a lot of that's in the above ground biomass, right? And so the biomass is either burned periodically or it's harvested and used in some way. So it's no longer going to be released back, at least into the waterways. And then, we're looking at opportunities to actually rotate prairie strips on, say, 10 or 15-year rotations, so that we would remove a strip, cultivate that strip, and then create a strip adjacent to that particular area to take advantage of increases in soil organic matter and carbon and maybe some nutrient dynamics that are being isolated within that former strip area. So we are kind of looking at these sorts of things, but in my mind, there's not a concern about releasing nutrients if that strip gets utilized for cropping at some later date.
Excellent, thank you, John. And I'm just going to, any other questions, please put them in the chat box. And while you do that, okay. There is Brad is making a point. The TruTerra Insights engine seems to accomplish all the in-field profit environmental outcome accounting that is being described in the strips analysis. So John, I don't know if you're familiar with the TruTerra Insights engine, but anything else you would like to comment on that?
Yeah, there's a number of different tools that are out there. Some of them are for pay, like the TruTerra Insights engine is. There's others that we are developing as part of a different project that's going to be publicly available that will attempt to do at least subfield profitability types of analyses. We've also been working on advancing the agricultural conservation planning framework, which is a GIS tool used for spatial allocation of best management practices, and we've built into that a financial analysis tool, so you can do cost effectiveness testing and those kinds of things. So again, there's a whole number of different tools out there that do very similar things. Ours is freeware. It's also open source, so people can take it and advance it as they wish. We provide some software guidelines on how to do that if you wanted to, and so on. So yeah, there's some really good stuff out there, and I think that the future is wide open in terms of all of this high resolution data that people can use in relatively easy ways to do some fairly sophisticated analyses that weren't possible just 5 years ago. So the future is wide open here.
Excellent, thanks, and thanks, Brad, for that respectful comment about not intending to advertise or promote, but doing it from a knowledge perspective for all of our participants. Appreciate that. And I will. There's been some dialogue here between Chris and Laura, but I particularly want to highlight an issue that Chris brought up related to harmful algal blooms and the potential for harm in some of those reservoirs related to harmful algal blooms. Not that that's been documented, but just raising it as a potential issue. And I will use that prompt to just say team affiliated with the North Central Region Water Network, the Harmful Algal Action Bloom team, is going to have a symposium coming up January 6th and 7th related to HAB, so just a little plug there. And I'm also now going to plug the 2 additional webinars coming up: drought decision calendars for specialty crops from our North Central Climate Team, and that's Monday, December 14th at 1 p.m. Central. And our Soil Health Nexus team has their Digital Cafe series, Just in Time Soil Health, Wednesday, December 16th at 2 p.m. Central. And finally, thank you all for participating today, and thank you so much to our presenters for sharing your time and your insights with us. We really appreciate it, and hope you have a lovely holiday season, and look forward to seeing you and talking with you in the new year. Thanks, everybody.